So let's get one thing straight right off the top. RL Peyton was not a great guy. In fact, we can pretty much classify him as a criminal in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the common citizenry. But look, you don't manage to go straight from the seat of your top fuel car in the starting line at Bristol in 1968 to the local jail in record time by being normal. No, RL Peyton was crazy. This guy was a grifter, he was a thief, he could be violent, and really that's just the start. But the whole thing is, he really was a heck of a drag racer. Beyond all of that is the fact that there's a huge irony in the idea that of all the things this guy did, a single photo circulating around the internet, this one, and its origins end up getting attributed to the wrong guy. This was one of RL Peyton's proudest moments. And before we get into all that, there's a lot more you need to know and understand about old RL Peyton of Florida and the sport he loves so much. For starters, as much as some people are loath to admit it, the sport of drag racing was not necessarily built on the backs of humble, morally upstanding, God-fearing people. There were and are plenty of them around, but the real movers and shakers in the opening decades of drag racing, by and large, they had their own interpretation of the law and which ones actually applied to them and which did not. The roots of the sport and the street racing culture of the 1950s galvanized the rebel attitude into many, many people, and loads of them would take that same attitude and leverage it into fame and stardom on the strips of America. There were some legendarily bad ones. Guys like Billy the Kid Stepp of Dayton, Ohio. He basically ran that city, and not only did he love that underworld business, he loved drag racing and wasn't afraid to play into his gangster image. He was so brazen about it, he played a gangster on the pages of one of the biggest car magazines in the world in the 1970s. The man was tried more than 10 times for a variety of activities that range from petty to downright gnarly, and Billy the Kid Stepp was never convicted. One FBI agent once calling him the most charmed gangster in the country. The same cannot be said for Rufus Boyd, who is known in drag racing circles as Brooklyn Heavy. Boyd drove early on and then bankrolled loads and loads of cars throughout the early and middle 70s. From street racing pro stock cars to the legal efforts of Herb McCandless, Brooklyn Heavy was everywhere, including the FBI's watch list. As it turns out, Rufus Boyd was one of the largest narcotics dealers in New York City and was convicted as such in 1976, going to prison for decades on drug and tax evasion charges. And then there is, of course, the unparalleled intergalactic champion of drag racing bad guys, Broadway Freddie DeName. Involved in more than 100 gangland murders, he was a guy who loved funny cars and made several very, very poor showings when he attempted to drive them every now and again in the 70s. DeName did not live long enough to testify against his one-time mafia cronies. So back to RL Peyton. This guy, as much of a scofflaw as he was, doesn't begin to scratch the surface of the big league criminal activity like the above-mentioned guys did. Over the course of a life that spanned nearly 70 years, Peyton did spend at least a decade of it in prison and maybe more than a year of additional recovery in hospitals coming off of drag racing crashes, but Full Throttle does not begin to describe this guy's life. RL Peyton grew up in Florida, the son of a band leader who was based in and spent most of his time in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father's music career allowed the family to purchase a large home and property in Florida where RL, his brothers and sisters all grew up. It was here on that expanse of land that Peyton grew to become obsessed with mechanics and cars. His wild streak showed early on, and he turned running from the police at his hot rod into a local sport, often beating the heat back to his own house before they arrived. This evolved into street racing and eventually evolved into a successful campaigning of an A-gas car. Supposedly, it was a Studebaker that had a 426 wedge Chrysler motor in it. Through the running of the A-gas car, he met a guy named Barry McMillan. McMillan, out of Daytona Beach, Florida, was wealthy and very much into cars and drag racing. Using his cunning skills, he sold McMillan on the idea of footing the bill for a top fuel dragster and all the associated equipment. McMillan bit, RL Peyton set to work, and the McMillan and Peyton Top Fuel team was born. There is absolutely one thing that can never be taken away from RL Peyton beyond all else. He was really an intuitive genius when it came to building cars and tuning engines. The guy's stuff was fast. He did drive like an absolute lunatic and did crash a lot, but he was also capable of running with the largest names in the world when he hit the scene of Top Fuel in the 1965 timeframe. Peyton's career in Top Fuel is filled with some really interesting footnotes, the first of which comes in 1965. Largely because of the money McMillan had to throw around, RL Peyton had one of the first 426 Hemi-powered Top Fuel dragsters in the world. Some slick talking by Peyton and McMillan's money got them one of the earliest engines that Chrysler sent out to an independent team to go take nitro drag racing. RL made headlines locally in Florida by running over 200 miles an hour, which was still a major accomplishment of note in this time frame. At a meet in West Palm Beach, he actually outran Don Garlits for low ET at an NHRA divisional race. He ran 7:45 to Garlett's 7:49, and that got the attention of the drag racing populace. Peyton, a shameless self-promoter, then took his act on the road, beating down the bushes and calling drag strips to book himself in as a match racing act. By the end of the year, he had managed to get himself all the way to California to participate in the famed Mickey Thompson 200-mile-an-hour meet, which was at the time the hardest core top fuel race ever held. There were 58 registered participants in the race, and every single one of them had run more than 200 miles an hour in the past year to get themselves a spot. Since all of this seems to be going so well, it's time for us to stop right now and fill in some of the more interesting details of RL Peyton and his personality. For starters, his dragster was named the Big Bamboo. This was in reference to a calypso song that he heard in a bar one night. Now, we really liked the song and the subject matter of the song itself, which the title and lyrics refer to the significant nature of the manhood of its subject. In order to make sure the point got across, the brake handle in R.L. Peyton's car, which protruded above the cowl of the cockpit, was crafted in the likeness of an overgrown part of the male anatomy. You've gotta love this guy. Peyton again made headlines in 1966 at the AHRA Spring Nationals in Bristol, Tennessee. As was reported at the time, Peyton showed up to the racetrack without a blower belt, without any nitro of his own, or without a pair of slicks to put on the back of his car. He begged, he borrowed, and some say he stole the stuff he needed, but he rolled to the starting line in the first round after qualifying and defeated Tom Hoover in early eliminations. This was the biggest thing that happened in Peyton's career to this point, and the reason being, this was a national level event that had media coverage from every magazine in the country from Hot Rod on down, and his name appeared in all of them because of this single round upset. Not only did his name show up, but the unique nature of his car was profiled as well. This was a very long for the time 170-inch race car specialties built chassis. Peyton always believed that a longer wheelbase was better, and at this time in history, a 170-inch car was pretty long. You can note in this photo that the crank pulley is almost touching the ground as the cars are heading up the racetrack after being push-started from the top end. This, in fact, is the preview to the run against Tom Hoover. That's Hoover's car in the foreground of this photo. After beating Hoover, he didn't have any more fuel to use because the fuel he had borrowed and stolen from other teams had run out. So what did he do? Apparently, as the story goes, he beat Hoover back to the pit area and had already begun helping himself to some of Tom's, well, unneeded nitro before Hoover actually got his car back into the pit area. Once again, R.L. Hoover resorted to whatever tactics he needed to survive. Peyton's grand upset of Tom Hoover didn't end in the next round. In fact, he got down to the final 3 cars and almost made it to the final round, except the car broke an axle and that put him out in the semis. With a sponsor still backing his program and the match race money coming in to pay the bills, R.L. Peyton did something pretty wild for 1967. As mentioned before, he always liked the idea of a longer wheelbase, so he decided to go absolutely whole hog. Cutting the front end off his RC chassis that he had run in 1966, Peyton added an additional 5 feet, yes, 60 inches of length to the front of this car, making it for the time the longest dragster in the world at 230 inches wheelbase. The car was so long that tech officials began to try to fail it when he would show up to races to compete. It took RL's sweet talking and his ability to argue successfully that there was only a minimum wheelbase rule and no maximum wheelbase rule that got him on the racetrack. The car was as flexible as a piece of wet spaghetti, and it bowed so much it would often scrape the oil pan on the ground upon deceleration. This was so bad that he began carrying multiple oil pans to swap out at each event, as he would continually grind the bottoms out of them every time he let off the gas at the top end. The other major problem was the car would occasionally touch the crankshaft pulley to the ground, and of course that's where the blower belt resided, and the blower belts would shred as soon as they touched the ground at any sort of speed. This was one of the car's major flaws and something that cost him a lot of money in round wins. Peyton once said that he considered drag racing as a weightlifting contest, so his cars were always very minimalist and light. Wild as it sounds, his Flexi Flyer won a lot of match races. R.L. Peyton's stock, as crazy as it seems, was on the rise. Barry McMillan's money afforded the team a swanky brand new Buick Riviera tow vehicle to haul their small enclosed trailer, and through this time the stories of women, pharmaceuticals, occasionally shady dealings, brushes with the law, and the active transport of materials and substances not sanctioned by the government are legendary. It was the best time of his career, and one could assume the best time of his life. 1967 really was the high point for R.L. Peyton. 1968 is the year that things took a turn for the weird and really showed what R.L. Peyton was willing to do to go top fuel racing and seek the fame and fortune he felt he was so richly deserved. In early 1968, Peyton headed west to Southern California to run some of the winter races and get himself prepared for the season. Peyton hurt the engine at Lyons Drag Strip and then managed to get into some sort of an altercation with Barry McMillan. McMillan. Unfortunately, that was enough for the money man, and he informed RL that he could keep the Buick, he could keep the dragster, he could keep the tools and the parts, but Barry McMillan was not going to give him another blessed dime to run the car. As if this situation wasn't bad enough, later on in the weekend, RL Peyton would throw the rods through the side of the last decent race block that he had. Dejected, he loaded up the Buick and angrily headed south to Florida. Along the way, he managed to blow up the Buick too. Things are not going well. Out of money and seemingly out of hope, Peyton turned to the one place he knew he could find some money and funding. Where was that? It was his network of criminal friends. A car thief in Florida needed a favor done, and in exchange for that favor, he would pass RL Peyton a wallet full of credit cards. Now, in the 2020s, that doesn't seem to mean much, but in 1968, there was not a computer tracking system of credit cards. If one played their cards right, literally, these things could be a source of free income for what seemed like eternity. Assuming the financial identity of one D. James Schmidt, RL Peyton was back in Top Fuel business. The only real downside of this plan, and it was a fixable flaw, was the fact that at this time in history, not every place took a credit card. You still needed to have some cash flow coming in, and that's what RL Peyton planned to do with his match racing efforts. He would use match racing to make cold hard cash and use the credit cards to live off of. Knowing what you now know about this guy, you can imagine after he got his hands on this plastic pit of endless money, he didn't waste any time. He bought a new wardrobe, $1,000 worth of tools from Sears, managed to buy an old truck with 4 fresh tires to haul the car around while the Buick got fixed, and he did something else that was pretty interesting and speaks to his criminal mind. He went to the junkyard and stripped a whole bunch of license plates off junk cars. The reason he did this was the fact that every time they fueled the truck up while towing the car across the country, they would pull over and change the plates before they got there. The license plate number would be recorded with a credit card slip at the gas station. Keeping the plates random at each fill-up meant that they couldn't be tracked by the rudimentary means the credit card companies had back in the day. With this seemingly perfect plot hatched, he jumped in the truck with his brother Hap and his other brother Terry, and they were on the road again. Now, there's likely still a number of people watching this that don't understand why this scheme could go on virtually forever. Consider this. Before stores were able to conduct electronic credit card transactions, the cards weren't physically swiped into anything other than a piece of carbon paper. The license plates he used would throw anybody off the trail that tried to track him. There was no way to shut a credit card off back in this time because even if you did, no one would know it. Unless you physically revoked the card out of somebody's hand, they could use it in perpetuity until they got caught. When you combine all those factors and then add in Peyton's already slick thinking mind, now you can understand how a guy could go out and with basic anonymity run a Top Fuel car off a couple of stolen credit cards. The true legend of RL Peyton was born at Bristol in 1968 at the AHRA Spring Nationals. One of the most widely shared historical photos on the internet shows the drag strip at Bristol International Dragway covered from end to end in aluminum cans and broken glass. That's because of RL Peyton. And the photos that show that track showered in aluminum cans and glass tell the end of a story, but the beginning of the story was way better. It was the first round of the Spring Nationals, and RL Peyton was to face off against Gene Mooneyham of Louisiana in Top Fuel. And here's where things get interesting because there are two versions of this story. What we know is this. We know that it's Mooneyham, we know that it's Peyton, and we know the starter that day was Dave Berube of New England Dragway. New England Dragway at the time was an AHRA-sanctioned track. Berube, a long-time and experienced starter, was likely a guy that they brought out to do this race because of his reputation. So, knowing all of those things, let's hear the first version of the story, which is the one told by Hap, RL Peyton's younger brother. The version that Hap tells is that Peyton fired his car, did his burnout, and was running for up to 5 minutes before his competitor got his car to fire up. At that point, rather than sending RL Peyton down on a single run, Peyton shut his car off because it was way too hot. Mooneyham, the competitor that seemingly struggled to start his car, was allowed to stage and run for a single, disqualifying Peyton, and Peyton lost his mind. The official story that's reported by not only the AHRA, but several magazines that were on hand to cover the event goes as follows. RL Peyton fired his car up, did his burnout, and then crossed a yellow line at the starting line area that AHRA mandated a window of 30 seconds to stage after crossing. Peyton failed to stage after the 30 seconds, the starter sent Mooneyham, and that was that. And then Peyton lost his mind. The easiest thing to do in this instance is understand one thing. Peyton lost his mind. And when I'm saying lost his mind, He really did, beyond perhaps more than anybody else ever has in the history of Top Fuel, and that includes some of the greatest hothead race car drivers of all time. In either instance, and no matter what side of the story you're on, this is when things begin to get interesting. The incensed Peyton came out of his car like a caged animal, and he went straight to Berube, who rebuffed him. Then he went for the other starting line officials, and then wildly began screaming toward the crowd about the injustice that had just been perpetrated upon him. Peyton then spotted something. There was a busted-off length of drive shaft lying next to the wall, so he grabbed it and then headed back to the starting line. By this time, the race had been stopped for 10-plus minutes, and AHRA President Jim Tice, clad in his familiar bright red coat, had approached the starting line, and he had not come alone. He had brought with him sheriff's deputies and a tow truck. The tow truck wasn't just there to grab the dragster, it was also there to grab the Buick Riviera, which had since been repaired, and during this tirade, one of Peyton's crew guys had driven it to the other side of the racetrack and parked it to block the other lane. This was turning into a pretty significant mess. So now, screaming at Tice and waving the busted-off drive shaft in his face, the sheriffs began to close in on all sides. Blindsided from the back by one of the lawmen and pinned down and handcuffed, the crowd went berserk and began to throw anything and everything they could onto the racetrack as RL Peyton was dragged off into the back of a squad car. The photos here show the aftermath of the event. Now, there's some debate as to whether they threw the stuff in support of RL Peyton or they threw the stuff in anger that RL Peyton hung up the drag race that they had all paid their hard-earned money to show up and watch. If you can believe it, as Peyton was being driven out of the racetrack, the shower of glass and aluminum hadn't stopped. After the crowd ran out of ammunition, the track crew approached and began an hours-long cleanup process on the drag strip. As for Peyton, he got dragged down to the local courthouse and went before an annoyed judge who had been called into the court on a Sunday, and in the interest of likely wanting to get home, only fired him $25 and sent him back to the track to pack up his stuff with police supervision. The end result of the race was that it ran late into the night after the hours-long delay that had been caused to finish up on Sunday, and we suspect RL Peyton was laughing his whole way out of the racetrack that afternoon. This is when things get kind of murky regarding the career of RL Peyton. We assume he was banned from AHRA events. The funny thing is, the match race ads disappear, the result stories disappear, and while I can't place the date exactly, the one that officially ended his career took place somewhere in the late 1968, early 1969 timeframe. Remember, for the better part of a year now, RL Peyton had been living on stolen credit cards and using a fake name for all of it. As you can imagine, he'd been doing some other things as well. Car theft, some transportation of restricted substances, hanging out on the sailboat of a rich Georgia attorney, and basically being his wide-open self. Apparently in need of a new block for the race car and out of means to buy one, he got caught stealing a Hemi Charger from a shopping center. As bad as this is, the plot twist is way worse. As the story goes, he made a call to get bailed out, and when his girlfriend came in, she assumed he had used the name off the credit cards in his wallet when he was arrested. He hadn't. He used his real name. When his girlfriend asked to bail out Mr. Schmidt, things got very interesting at the police station. They went into his wallet, found the credit cards, began the investigation, and RL Peyton ended up for an extended stay in jail for a multitude of crimes. Once Peyton got out, his race car was gone, his girlfriend was gone, and any hopes of reviving a drag racing career were gone as well. He'd later go back to jail for placing a gun to the head of an off-duty police officer who had previously arrested him. RL Peyton would never drag race again and would live the rest of his days spending time in the islands operating sailboats and apparently trying a couple of different failed business ventures stateside. He died in 2012 at the age of 67, a beer-drinking wild man right up until the last days of his life. And that is the story of RL Peyton, all spawned by investigating one drag race photo of a strip covered in aluminum and glass. Most of the elements of RL Peyton's life are not to be emulated or not to be repeated or not to be followed as an example, but there are a couple of things in there that, well, maybe all of us could take a small lesson from. Wherever RL Peyton is right now, pretty much guarantees having a great time. Like and subscribe for more wacky, historic, weird and fun racing, automotive, and historical content. Thanks for watching.